Hi there, this is Ronnie, coming at you with a video. I've just watched the latest video from Pear of Geeks, where Becky Rhodes is talking about using board games, particularly some of these more sort of advanced, involved board games, as a springboard for creating a world and an adventure that you can then use as inspiration for an RPG scenario or campaign. And there's really two parts to this for me. First of all, what did I think about the sort of general points being made? And then two, at the end, Becky was asking about other games. And that's going to be slightly longer for me. Certainly, I mean, many moons ago, I did a video about using video games as inspiration. And many of the points I made there apply to board games. I'd even say board games and card games, for reasons I'll come on to. And I certainly think you can use them as inspiration. I would even go so far as to say, maybe not direct but indirect inspiration. What do I mean by that? I've told this little story before, but there's a song by a power metal band called Manowar called Defender, and I used that song as the inspiration for a game many years ago. And it wasn't a direct punt from it. It inspired an idea that I sort of went with for my scenario. And this is where I come on to the second half of this about the games. I should say I'll put a link into for Becky's. It's a good video, worth a watch. Her Darth Vader impression is really rather good. But when it comes to games, I think you can find inspiration from just about anywhere. The question becomes, what are you looking to inspire? And what I mean is, I have games, some quite simple games. Some are card games, some are board games that would lend themselves to a scenario, not a full campaign. It's a short 1, 2, maybe three session little game, rather than a huge campaign. And they're not necessarily big, heavy games. I mean, I'm looking at my games now, and I look at something like Cluedo. Use the inspiration of Cluedo, take the map, do some pre-gen characters maybe, and do a murder mystery. Have an RPG of a murder mystery. That would work. I look at something like Castle Panic. You could have a scenario, 2 sessions of the player characters being stuck in a tower, having to defend it against all comers, and that whole thing, and the sort of tension and everything of having to do that. Dead of Winter, actually that could straddle both. You could do a long campaign of a sort of long winter, of having to survive with this undead and having to deal with resources. You could easily do a sort of long scenario or campaign out of that. Pandemic, have all your player characters be sort of scientists and researchers and people like that, and having to go and find and sort of contain areas of containment for people who have been exposed to a deadly infection and trying to find a cure and isolating things. You can make incredibly intense. That could really go to a campaign. You can make a really intense game of that. Betrayal at House on the Hill. You could do a haunted house based on that. I mean, Becky mentions Twilight Imperium, which just seems to, cry out for the setting for an RPG. And thank you for the nod to Tiny Epic Galaxies. I'm glad you like it. I also have Master of Orion, which is based on a video game. It's a video game that's become a sort of board card game thing that could easily inspire a role-playing game. Even Star Realms could inspire something. You could take it, sort of work that universe of those 4 factions and work a scenario within it. A board game like Diplomacy, it's a role-playing game with a map. I mean, Diplomacy really has you working. Archon could do it. Lords of Waterdeep, dealing with the sort of machinations of a town. There's so much. I mean, the kind of biggies that I have, the sort of heavy hitters that I have, in terms of that sort of big, complex thing, would probably be something. Zangwo probably would come under that. Shogun, Total War, the Shogun by Queen Games. Warrior Knights, Game of Thrones, a board game. Fief France 1429 is kind of a fave at the moment. But the point is that you can take the game, and you don't have to do it as a you could, as sort of Becky describes, you could play the game and sort of look at the sort of last positions of everyone when the game ends, and you could focus in on one sort of area of kind of conflict and go with that. And I think that's a good idea. I like that idea. But there's if you've got a little bit of creativity, even something fairly simplistic as Lancaster could inspire a game of machinations and sort of and so on. It depends on even something like Hotel Tycoon. It's wherever you find a bit of inspiration that makes you go, oh, but we could expand that. Even a really math heavy board game that I have, which is Power Grid. Building a city, getting the power up in a city. You could make a game out of that. Inspiration can happen. It may not be a direct continuation of a game that you've had. I got Solaris, which is basically trying to keep a space station running. There's a scenario right there. There's lots that you can do with a board game if you're prepared to think a little outside the box with them. Some of them, the more complex ones that are really in depth and lots of backgrounds about various factions, lend themselves well to role-playing games, particularly campaigns. But any game, pretty much, if there's some sort of story or background or something about it, some of them are just too abstract. You couldn't get away with it. You couldn't make an RPG out of Scrabble. Although the person who tries, I would like to shake them by the hand if he did. But even something as simplistic as coup or love letter has potential if you think outside the box, if you create outside the box, and look at the world around where this little game is happening. I think you might actually come up with an interesting game. I think you come a cropper if you try and emulate the board game. Use it as your inspiration, your springboard, which is something that Becky sort of mentions. Use it as the jumping off point. I think the closest you would get to maybe emulating would be something like Cluedo or Betrayal at House on the Hill. Betrayal at House on the Hill would be really, really funny if you did have the traitor mechanic in it, similar with Dead of Winter actually. If you have the traitor mechanic and you actually secretly have one of the characters be a traitor who's actually working against the rest of them, secretly sort of passing notes to the GM about how they're disrupting things. Yeah, I like that idea actually. Now that I think about it. I also have The Godfather, Corleone's Empire, which I've got to get round to playing at some point. But that whole thing could easily make a scenario as well. So yeah, use board games. Use them, the end of a board game being, and the sort of intensity of it being the jumping off point, or anything that sparks a creative flow, even if it's barely tangential to the board game. If it's something that even sparks an idea where you kind of go, but what if we, but if we did that we could, and then we could, and then we could, and if you get that process going, you probably have an interesting scenario. So those are my thoughts. I'll put Becky's video down below. Watch the Pear of Geeks video, possibly before watching mine actually, but and I hope between the two of them you get some ideas. Have a look at your board game collection, your card game collection. Unless it's very, 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 very basic, there will be something that will spark an idea that you can use as the inspiration for a scenario, be it a one shot, a small scenario, or a campaign. The inspirations are there, folks. Go get them.